And now we're going to talk about two illustrative drive states, hunger and sexual arousal, because these are two big motivating factors. So with hunger, generally triggered by low blood glucose in the blood. Sorry. Low glucose levels in the blood. What is the behavior's aim? To restore that homeostasis, right? Get those fats back in your body to maybe build that blood sugar back up. And we're also, when we enter these different drive states, once we kind of reach that end goal, we have to find the reward value of fulfilling that need, right? What pleasure do we derive from that food or that sexual experience? Now, and when I mentioned the fats being broken down, that's an example of an internal cue. Maybe we've burned up all this fat for all this energy, and our body's like, hey, I need more. You're running a marathon today. I don't know. That's an internal cue. An external cue is going to hint us about our different drive states outside of our bodies. So these can be anything from time of day, estimated time until our next feeding, or the sensory experience of food and related stimuli. So your sense of smell, your olfactory sense, has a lot to do with how we bring in food. Maybe you weren't hungry, but all of a sudden you went to do work in the library and you got a nice whiff of food from the grill, you know? These sensory experiences are going to cue us or kind of trigger us to enter these drive states on a certain level. So our hunger is just trying to correct for those nutritional imbalances. And our hypothalamus is going to have a lot to do with hunger. So as you remember from our unit, psychobiology unit, hopefully, your hypothalamus is responsible for your homeostatic processes. So everything from blood pressure, temperature, hunger, all these things, it's going to help secrete those hormones to balance out these processes. So your lateral hypothalamus, I'm going to flip back and forth between the slides because I do have a picture. So your lateral hypothalamus is, here, let me go first. Your hypothalamus is located here, right in the midbrain. Well, your lateral hypothalamus is going to be responsible for kind of stimulating the body to be hungry. So that's going to be right here. So if we zoom in on the hypothalamus, it's going to be in the back. And the ventromedial hypothalamus is going to be responsible for satiety. So telling us, releasing those chemicals when our body's like, hey, I'm full, you need to stop eating. That's why sometimes people say you need to eat slower because it gives your body time to send that response from your stomach to your brain to let you know that you're full. In one study by Brendel et al. In 2003, they wanted to see how they could prime a participant to rate certain items. I tried to find this study, and I couldn't, but I'll look again. I always have my resources if you're interested. But what they did was they had participants hold a handful of popcorn while completing an assessment task. And what they noticed is that people rated, they had a list of items. And the people who had the popcorn in their hand rated food items higher than the group that did not. And this is kind of demonstrative of that idea that the hunger or the drive, the goal of the drive is going to take priority when compared to other things that are going to take the background. And also, an important process in this is our sensory cortices. So we think about our auditory senses. Well, that's not so much used in food, right? Unless you're hearing about a word of food. But think about your occipital cortex, identifying the food by sight. The sensory cortices are important for identifying those food items. But they're not going to tell us whether they're quote-unquote good or bad. But they do have a role in helping us decide which foods to eat. And again, there's a picture. Hypothalamus. Here's your lateral hypothalamus. It's like in the back of this picture. This is the best illustration I could find. And then the ventromedial hypothalamus, which is just going to be kind of in the middle with that ventromedial. Satiety, hunger. Now with sexual arousal is going to be critical for reproduction. I know sometimes it's kind of animalistic in some sense, right? So our thoughts, these are going to be our thoughts and behaviors related to sexual activity. And there are going to be internal and external mechanisms for sexual arousal. Different parts of the brain are going to be more active during sexual arousal. But unlike hunger, men and women are going to differ in what parts of the brains are stimulated during sexual arousal and sexual activity. So you're going to have internal and external mechanisms. If you could take a guess, what do you think is an internal mechanism for sexual arousal? What do you think is an external mechanism? Right? Well, an internal mechanism could be the parts of our brain at work that are processing these cues. External mechanisms could be different, how do I want to say this? These could be things that have cued us into the possibility of engaging in a sexual activity. So sometimes the extended absence of sexual activity can heighten someone's drive state to find that activity. And then there's also the immediate presence and possibility of sexual activity that can heighten someone's drive state as well. If something feels imminent, it's going to feel close, so it may encourage us to seek that behavior. And these are going to vary between men and women. So what we found is that with men, the preoptic area, called the anterior hypothalamus, so if we go back to our little picture, your anterior means the front end of your hypothalamus. Somewhere up in there, right? The anterior hypothalamus is going to be responsible for encouraging the preoptic area. It's going to release different hormones, and we found that there is a lot of processing, a lot of brain activity with sexual arousal in this part of the brain. And it also happens to overlap with aggressive responses. And so when we look at this, I guess from a biopsychological perspective, or even evolutionary psychological perspective, it serves its purpose, right? We typically see that a lot of hormones that men are dealing with have to do with aggression and protection and asserting dominance to mate and continue their species. Well, with women, we've found that the ventromedial hypothalamus, so the thing that also is responsible for our satiety, is going to be responsible for excreting estradiol. So this is a hormone that is going to affect sexual receptivity. Typically what we find, certain parts of the brain are going to be more or less stimulated with women. Well, let me back that up. The study that we look at examining the brain and sexual arousal in reference to this specific process is going to look at the brains of female rats. And so what they found was that estradiol, when it was secreted, it lowered the defense mechanisms of the rat and made them more susceptible to a mate. So things in animals that would normally be kind of a stress response, like freezing. Sometimes animals do that when they're scared. You ever see a mouse run around and they stop, that's because they're scared, right? So these different fear responses that kind of serve to protect the animal are decreased with the secretion of estradiol. And so they're more receptive to that sexual activity. And so we can kind of generalize some of these common trends to women from different studies with rats. So again, that defensive response is inhibited in the periaqueductal gray area of the brain with the freezing and all those things of that nature. And it also happens to coincide that the areas of the brain that are responsible for that sexual arousal in women are going to overlap with nurturance. So maybe that has to do with bearing offspring and facilitating that offspring's growth so that they can be a continuation of the species. You see where I'm getting at with kind of some of this evolutionary perspective? If you need any more information, I can look it up for you, but it's a little outside of the purview of our class for our purposes. But one thing that both men and women have in common is the increased activity in the septal nucleus. So, during sexual activity or intercourse, There is increased brain activity during sexual orgasms for both men and women in the septal nucleus. Fun fact. So, I know we talk about sexual arousal in different activities, and sexual arousal can be something that's so subjective based on people's preferences, and sometimes people don't want to talk about those things because it can be very taboo or candid. But research into sexual arousal has developed over the years to become more systematic, so we can make these certain generalizations. So when we examine sexual arousal, think of how we can truthfully examine such a taboo concept. Well, research into sex and arousal, I couldn't teach this lesson without bringing in Alfred Kinsey and the Masters and Johnson study. Now, Alfred Kinsey in 1948 released Reports of Sexual Behavior. So he had a version that said Reports of Sexual Behavior for the Human Male, Reports of Sexual Behavior for the Human Female. And what he did was in 1948, that's a time when sexual behavior was not talked about. It was very taboo. Freud was coming in. And it was just to see what kind of patterns existed in people's sexual experiences in terms of self-pleasure, masturbation, what types of intercourse people were engaging in. These were all topics that Kinsey sought to study, to bring to light, make sex more of a scientific concept, right? And looking at attitudes towards homosexuality. So how people reported having homosexuality or homosexual thoughts despite the fact that they identified as heterosexual. And this is where we get the idea of a Kinsey scale. So a Kinsey scale just rates pretty much where you fall in terms of your sexuality is more fluid. It's not specifically homosexual, heterosexual. It's more like degrees and variance. So you fall within a certain line on a spectrum. Think of this as if this were a scale. I know this is a different picture, but this line, instead of being a strict category, a dichotomous category, it would fall in line in a spectrum where we can rate it along the line. So maybe someone identifies as heterosexual, but they would be more open to a homosexual experience. Maybe they'd be more in the middle, such as a bisexual. That was an example of something very important the Kinsey scale brought to psychological research. Now, there were some flaws in this study because if you think about it, it was self-reported. So, what are the issues with self-reported studies? Well, sometimes people aren't going to be honest. So maybe things that were considered even more taboo, like homosexuality, people didn't want to report as readily. This could just be another example. But it was monumental nonetheless, and y'all should know about it. Then we also have Masters and Johnson. So Masters and Johnson in 1966 sought to study physiological responses during sexual behavior. And this was a huge study because this got us into, there was always this desire to look at the biological processes in psychology, right, and make it more of a hard science. And this is what kind of started that sexual response research, looking into what actually happens during sex. And then we were able to branch off and look at different cognitive components of sex, right? So with the physiological responses during sexual behavior, they developed what was called the sexual response cycle. And largely for men and women, it remains the same. So with the initial sexual encounter, there's an excitement. So you see in this chart, we see arousal is going up, and then the x-axis is going to be your time progression. So time in the sexual response cycle. So there's a bit of excitement at first, and that's when the arousal increases in the individual. And there are certain physiological processes that accompany this, right? This could be a man getting an erection, or the women secreting different bodily fluids in the process. And then as the plateau, this is when the physiological functions are kind of at full scale and ready to be used for the active intercourse. With orgasm, we see that there is significant arousal, and this is the height of the sexual response cycle. So the arousal is at peak, and then after the orgasm is experienced with the contraction of the different muscles and all those different things that happen, There's a resolution. So the body is trying to return to that unaroused state. Women are more likely than men. Women can usually engage in this cycle much more quickly than men, so they can repeat that cycle much more quickly, whereas men experience a refractory period where their body has to take a little more time to restore to be able to maintain and garner another erection for the act of sexual activity. But if you're interested in the sexual response cycle, more information can be found in the OpenStax text. It has more details on the different phases and what happens physiologically. I just wanted to insert them in here to kind of show you, our body goes through all these different processes even in the act of sex, and that's why sexual arousal is such an important drive for people. And it can be overwhelming for some. We talk about individual differences and how people direct their drives. And so I know there's a lot of talk about sex and there's a lot of misinformation going on, but I just want you to understand how much this can motivate in human behavior, and how it diverts our attention away from more pro-social, selfless tasks to maybe more selfish means to execute that drive state. It's good to be aware of these things, basically. And the more you know. In summary, drive states are evolved motivational mechanisms. So they are self-beneficial actions. We are trying to sate our need for hunger, to fill that thirst, to have sex when that drive state of sexual arousal is present, right? These are all things that seek to benefit the proliferation of our species. Many drive states, including, there are different ones besides sex and hunger. I think those are just the big ones we often talk about. But you have thirst, you have exhaustion. When you're tired, what do you seek to do? How does your mind drive you to find a source of relaxation, to go to sleep? Maternal drives, right? When a woman has a child, what drives her to protect that child, to help that child grow and develop? What changes in the mindset of a mother? And drug cravings. So how does someone who is addicted to drugs, how do they satiate that need for drugs? How does it change their emotions and thinking? Not to say we're completely out of control, but these do have a large influence on how we think and how we behave. And they're going to vary based on those internal and external cues. For example, thirst cues are largely internal, whereas drug cravings can have both internal and external components. Because thirst is just trying to, maybe we have too much salt content in our body and we need some water, right? That's an internal craving, an internal cue for that drive. Whereas drug cravings can have internal cues because our body has developed a need for that substance, whereas there are also external cues, which could be the time of day. Maybe they use consistently on a schedule. These things can come together to manipulate or encourage or motivate those drives. And there are going to be real-world consequences for those drive states, and I wish that our text would have talked about it a bit more, but I'm hoping that looking at that 2006 study, you can kind of see the real-world consequences or infer them from the data, right? We saw all that decision-making on behalf of those aroused men. It was affected. It could be affected by that state. And so sometimes we're going to behave in, not too pro-social ways, right? They're just not ill-suited for our modern lives. These are biological processes that serve to protect us, but in our modern times, they may not bode as well. For example, with hunger and obesity, that desire for food, and with so much access to not nutritional sources with high contents of bad fat, for example, are going to affect obesity, and they're so readily available that this mechanism may be ill-adapted to deal with our modern culture and that immediacy. And also with sexual drives. People who encourage in adulterous acts when they have social and financial power over others, right? We think of a lot when we talk about, the Me Too movement. So how people use their power dynamic in situations to sate those immediate needs and not regarding the other social factors such as proper consent. And there's just going to be sometimes a mismatch between drive states and the ability to fulfill them quickly. And that's pretty much what we're getting to with those previous examples. How do we sate those drive states? How do we sate them efficiently? And how do we sate them, I don't want to say properly, but how do we have more of a match between, if we're really craving a certain food, not eating something sugary and eating something healthier instead? How do we bring that match back in? But that's all for this lecture. I will have the next one posted by Thursday. So let me know if you have any questions, as always. Have a good week, and make sure you answer the discussion board.